Have you ever moved into a place that didn't quite feel right? That's how it started for me. The house wasn't anything fancy, a small, old structure built in the 1930s, with a strange layout and an unfinished porch. It wasn't perfect, but it was affordable, and I needed a home for both me and my elderly father, who uses a wheelchair. Finding a place that met our needs wasn't easy, so when I saw the listing online, I jumped at the chance. The landlord answered quickly when I called to inquire about the property. His tone was polite, but there was something about him, something I couldn't quite place. He seemed off. We set up a time for me to see the house on Saturday. In the days leading up to the meeting, he bombarded me with texts, asking for confirmation over and over again. "You're sure you'll be there? I don't like my time wasted," he wrote. It was annoying, but I brushed it off, figuring he was just particular. When the day finally came, my father and I arrived at the house, and the landlord was already waiting outside. He greeted me with a big smile, but the moment he saw my father, his expression changed completely. The warm smile vanished, replaced by a cold, almost irritated scowl. "I thought it was just you," he said, ignoring my father completely. I stumbled over my words, apologizing for not mentioning him earlier, but he didn't seem interested in my explanation. He showed us around the house, pointing out its quirks while barely acknowledging my father's presence. Despite his attitude, the house seemed livable, so I handed over the deposit and signed the lease. I told myself it was just one uncomfortable moment, nothing to worry about. But looking back now, that first interaction should have been my warning, a sign that something wasn't quite right. That's how it all began. And trust me, it only got worse from there. The first real encounter with the landlord was even stranger than I expected. On the day we moved in, everything seemed fine at first. My father and I were busy settling into the house, trying to make it feel like home. Then, the landlord showed up, claiming he needed access to fix some plumbing issues. I agreed, thinking it was just routine maintenance. He assured me it wouldn't take long, and I told him I'd leave the key above the door since I'd be at work. That's when things started feeling off. He sent me multiple texts that morning, asking again and again if I'd definitely be out of the house until a specific time. He kept mentioning safety hazards and insisted he needed to know exactly when I'd return. It felt excessive, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I just wanted him to get the repairs done and leave us alone. But something about his tone in those texts stayed with me, like he was trying too hard. Moving into the house was supposed to feel like a fresh start, but things quickly took a strange turn. On our first weekend there, the landlord told me he needed to access the house again, this time for more maintenance. I told him it was fine, as long as he stuck to the times we agreed on. I even left a key for him to use while I was at work. That Monday, I got a text from him mid-morning, confirming I wasn't home yet. He asked again when I'd be back, even though I'd already told him several times. It felt controlling, but I just wanted to avoid any problems, so I reassured him I'd stay out until the agreed time. When I left work earlier than planned that day, I decided to stop by the house. As soon as I opened the front door, I felt something was wrong. The air inside was heavy, like someone had just been there. Then I heard the sound of footsteps rushing through the house. I moved toward my bedroom and saw him. My landlord was hurrying out through the back door, not even noticing I had come home. His car screeched out of the driveway seconds later. I stood there in shock, trying to process what had just happened. That's when I noticed the real problem. My bedroom had been disturbed, drawers pulled open, things scattered. My underwear drawer, specifically, was left wide open. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just about fixing a pipe. He had been snooping, violating my space in the most personal way. It was the first moment I realized this wasn't just an awkward landlord. This was something much darker. After that disturbing encounter, I couldn't stop thinking about what the landlord had been doing in my room. I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding, but deep down, I knew better. Over the next few days, I became more aware of little things that didn't add up, items out of place, doors unlocked when I was sure I had locked them. It was subtle, but enough to make me feel uneasy. One morning, I found the key I'd left for him sitting on the kitchen counter. I hadn't put it there. It felt like his way of reminding me that he could come and go as he pleased. That's when the sinking reality hit me. This man wasn't just my landlord. He was invading my space whenever he wanted, and there was nothing I could do about it without proof. I started to feel paranoid, constantly checking the locks and trying to spot anything unusual. Every noise in the house felt suspicious, every shadow a potential sign he was there. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about my privacy, it was about control. He was making it clear that this was his house, and I was only allowed to be there on his terms. As the days passed, the fear became harder to ignore. Every time I left the house, I worried about what I might come back to. Would more of my belongings be moved? Would something worse happen? The uncertainty gnawed at me, but I felt stuck. Finding a house that was wheelchair accessible had been hard enough, and moving again wasn't an option. I started double checking the locks and hiding anything personal, but it didn't feel like enough. Every time I heard a noise, my heart would race. Even when I was home, I didn't feel safe. The thought of confronting him crossed my mind, but what could I even say? He wasn't breaking any obvious rules, at least none that I could prove. The worst part was the helplessness. No matter how much I wanted to stand up to him or leave, I couldn't. I was trapped in this situation, counting down the months until the lease ended. Every day felt like walking on eggshells, never knowing when he'd cross another line. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was the crushing feeling that there was nothing I could do to stop it. It all came to a head one day when I decided to come home early again, hoping to catch him in the act if he was up to something. As I approached the house, my pulse quickened. The front door was unlocked, though I knew I had locked it before leaving. My stomach churned, but I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet, but something felt wrong. I walked through the living room and into my bedroom. There it was, my drawer, open again, and my belongings scattered. This time, it wasn't just my underwear drawer. My nightstand was open too, with papers and personal items tossed around. The invasion was worse than before. That's when I heard it, a faint creak from the back of the house. I froze, every instinct telling me to turn around and leave. But I forced myself to move, creeping toward the sound. As I reached the hallway, I saw him, my landlord, hurrying out the back door. He didn't even look back, slamming the door behind him and speeding off in his car. I stood there, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. It wasn't just snooping anymore. It felt calculated, intentional, and violating on a level I couldn't describe. This wasn't just about my privacy, it was about power. He was making it clear that he could do whatever he wanted, and I had no way to stop him. After that day, something changed in me. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was exhaustion. I felt drained, like the constant anxiety was eating away at me. I couldn't sleep without double checking every lock, and even then, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, sure I'd heard something. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like his, and I was just a guest he could torment whenever he wanted. I started second-guessing myself constantly. Was I overreacting? Was it really as bad as it seemed? But every time I tried to convince myself to let it go, the image of him walking out of my bedroom came rushing back. He had no respect for boundaries, no concern for how his actions were affecting me. What made it worse was knowing there was nothing I could do. Reporting him felt pointless without solid evidence, and moving out wasn't an option. I felt trapped in my own life, powerless to protect myself or my father. The weight of it all was suffocating, and it started to feel like there was no escape. In the end, I had no choice but to endure it. 12 long months stretched out in front of me, each day filled with unease and dread. I couldn't relax, couldn't feel safe, and couldn't stop wondering what he might do next. Every moment in that house felt like a constant reminder that he was always watching, always waiting for an opportunity. I counted down the days until the lease was over, knowing that leaving was my only way out. But even as I imagined finally walking away from that place, the thought lingered. What about the next tenant? Would they go through the same nightmare? Would they feel as powerless as I did? I wanted to warn someone, to do something to stop him, but I didn't know how. All I could do was survive, one day at a time, and hope that someday I'd forget the feeling of constantly looking over my shoulder. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the landlord who turned my home into a place of fear. Sometimes the most dangerous threats aren't from strangers, they're from the people who seem harmless at first. When I was a teenager, my family lived in an old, broken down house in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't much, but it was all we could afford at the time. The landlord lived nearby, just 2 miles away, which didn't seem like a problem at first. He seemed ordinary, maybe even forgettable. But looking back, I should have paid more attention to the way he acted. The house was isolated, surrounded by empty fields and a long driveway that stretched out from the main road. My dad and brothers worked hard to make ends meet, and my older brother even did small jobs for the landlord to help cover our rent. We didn't interact with him much, and when we did, he always made sure my dad was around. He never stayed long or gave us a reason to feel uneasy, at least, not at first. But something about him didn't sit right with me. I didn't like the way he looked at the house when he stopped by, as if he was checking on something that wasn't his business. I didn't say anything at the time. After all, we were just renting, and he had every right to visit. Or so I thought. It wasn't until much later that I realized how wrong I was. The first time the landlord showed up unannounced, I didn't think much of it. He parked his car in the driveway, walked around the outside of the house, and then left after about 10 minutes. It was strange, but I told myself he was probably just checking on the property. After all, it was his house. Still, something about it felt off. Then it happened again. Both times, I was home alone, and he didn't knock or try to let us know he was there. He didn't even seem to care if anyone was inside. He just walked around quietly, looking at the windows and doors before driving away. That's when the uneasiness started to grow. Why would he keep showing up like that? Why didn't he let my dad know he was coming? I started to notice a pattern. He only came by when the house was empty, except for me. It wasn't just a coincidence anymore. I couldn't explain it, but his presence felt wrong, like he was waiting for something. That's when I started to feel like maybe we weren't as safe as we thought. One afternoon, my dad and brothers went out, leaving me alone in the house. It was supposed to be a quiet day. I had my dog in the yard, and I stayed in my room, probably playing a game or reading. Being alone didn't bother me much back then, at least, not until that day. Out of nowhere, I heard the familiar crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. My heart dropped as I looked out the window and saw the landlord's car pulling up. He hadn't called or warned us he'd be coming. Panic set in immediately. I rushed to lock all the doors, close the blinds, and turn off the lights. I didn't want him to know I was home. I crouched near a window, watching as he got out of his car. He yelled at my dog to be quiet, then started walking toward the house. My mind raced. Why was he here? What did he want? I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever his reason, it wasn't good. I stayed frozen in place, hoping he would just leave. But deep down, I knew this time was different. As I stayed hidden, I could hear the landlord moving closer. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel made my stomach twist. He reached the front door and tried the handle. Locked. Then he moved to the back door and tried that one too. Locked again. My heart was racing, and I gripped the edge of the table I was hiding under, hoping he'd just give up. But he didn't. Instead, he started walking around the house, peering into the windows. He called out my name, his voice sharp and deliberate. He wasn't just checking the property anymore, he knew I was there. My dog barked frantically outside, and he shouted at it to shut up. The tension in the air was unbearable. I stayed perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. He kept circling the house, trying each door, rattling the handles as if he could force them open. I felt trapped, powerless to do anything but wait. The more he called out, the more it became clear that he wasn't just trying to scare me, he wanted me to come out. And the longer he stayed, the more terrified I became of what he'd do if I did. The situation got even worse when he stopped outside one of the windows and started speaking again. His voice was calm, almost casual, but the words he said were anything but. "I'm going to burn the house down," he said, "but I'll let you out first." My blood ran cold. Was he serious? Was this some kind of twisted joke? I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to believe he wasn't serious, but the way he said it like it was a simple fact made me question everything. He wasn't yelling or angry. He sounded calm, like he knew exactly what he was doing. The worst part was that I couldn't figure out why. Why was he threatening me? Why was he even here? The silence in the house felt heavier with every passing second. I stayed hidden, clutching the knife I'd grabbed earlier, praying he'd leave before anything worse happened. With no sign of him leaving, I knew I had to do something to protect myself. I stayed low, gripping the knife tightly, and moved quietly from the kitchen table to a darker corner of the room. My hands were shaking, but I couldn't let myself panic. I had already texted my dad, and he promised he was on his way, but I knew it would take him a while to get back. The landlord kept circling the house, muttering things I couldn't quite hear through the walls. Every so often, he'd call my name again, his voice louder and more demanding. I stayed as quiet as I could, trying not to let him know where I was. My dog barked wildly outside, which only seemed to make him more determined. He tried all the doors again, pulling harder this time, but they held. I could hear his frustration building, his footsteps getting heavier as he stomped around the house. I pressed myself against the wall, knife in hand, ready for anything. Every second felt like an hour, but finally, I heard his car start. Relief washed over me as I peeked through the blinds and saw him driving away. It wasn't over, but for now, I was safe. As soon as my dad and brothers got home, I told them everything. My voice was shaking, but I didn't leave out a single detail. The landlord showing up unannounced, trying to get into the house, the threats, everything. My dad's face grew darker with every word. He didn't question me, he believed me immediately. That alone gave me a small sense of relief. We didn't waste any time. My dad decided right then and there that we couldn't stay. No one argued. We knew the landlord wasn't going to stop, and there was no way we could feel safe in that house anymore. Within a few days, we started making arrangements to move. It wasn't easy, but it didn't matter. We had to get out. Looking back, I realized how close I had been to real danger. If my dad hadn't come home when he did, if the landlord had been more persistent, who knows what could have happened. All I knew was that leaving was the only choice. We couldn't stay, not after everything that had happened. Even after we moved out, the question stayed with me. How did he know I was alone that day? Was he watching the house, waiting for the right moment? Or was it just a terrible coincidence? I couldn't stop thinking about the way he had acted calm, calculated, like he had done this before. I kept replaying his words in my head, especially the threat to burn the house down. Did he actually mean it, or was he just trying to scare me into coming outside? Either way, the fear he caused was very real, and I knew he had been testing my limits. The idea that someone could hold that much power over me still gives me chills. I'll never know what his intentions were or how far he would have gone if I hadn't stayed hidden. But one thing is certain, I'll always trust my instincts from now on. The landlord may be out of my life, but the fear and unease he left behind will always be a part of me. Some questions don't have answers, and sometimes that's the scariest part of all. Sometimes the worst decisions are the ones you don't realize are mistakes until it's too late. That's exactly how it felt when my boyfriend and I moved into that flat. At first, it seemed perfect for us, a small, one-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't a big apartment building, it was part of a converted house, with us living upstairs and the landlord living downstairs. We were just starting out, and it felt like a step forward in life. We didn't meet the landlord right away because he was out of town when we viewed the flat. Looking back, I wish we had. By the time we met him, we had already signed the lease and moved in. He seemed polite enough at first, but there was something about him that set me on edge. His eyes were too intense, and his demeanor made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't explain. I should have trusted that gut feeling. During that first meeting, he went over the rules of the flat. No internet installation, no loud noises, and we had to use pound coins for the electric meter. It all felt a bit odd, but we didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a rental, after all. But what we didn't realize was that those first moments were only the beginning of what would become a nightmare. The first few weeks in the flat were strange, but we brushed it off as part of adjusting to a new place. Then, little things started standing out. The landlord seemed to watch everything we did. I'd come home late from work, and every time, I'd see his shadow in the window, just standing there. He never said anything, never greeted me, just watched. Then there was the story about his wife. One day, out of nowhere, he mentioned that she had passed away, and the flat was part of the house they had shared. He said it so casually, like it wasn't a big deal, but the way he spoke made me wonder if something wasn't quite right. I couldn't shake the thought of whether she had died in the flat where we were now living. There were also the utilities. The electric meter ate up more money than it should have, and he insisted we couldn't install internet because it would damage the walls. Everything about the setup seemed designed to keep us controlled and isolated. It wasn't enough to confront him over, but the unease kept growing. Deep down, I knew these weren't just quirks, they were warnings. Things took a turn when the landlord started showing up unannounced. At first, it was small things. He'd knock on the door, claiming he needed to check the electric meter or asking about repairs we hadn't requested. It felt odd, but we didn't think it was worth making a fuss over. Then came the sofa incident. He had told us we could do whatever we wanted with an old sofa he'd left in the flat, so my parents came by to take it. While they were loading it into their car, the landlord suddenly appeared, furious. He claimed it was an anniversary gift and demanded they put it back. His mood changed so quickly it was unsettling. We apologized and returned the sofa, but the way he acted made it clear something wasn't right. After that, he started letting himself into the flat whenever he wanted. He didn't knock or give any warning. Sometimes we'd come home and find small things moved, like he'd been snooping. Other times, he'd show up while we were there, acting as if he had every right to walk in. The flat no longer felt like ours, it felt like we were just borrowing it, under his constant watch. One day, the landlord showed up again, but this time it wasn't just a random visit. He barged in without notice, saying he needed to check the electric meter. My boyfriend let him in, trying to keep things civil. But what happened next was far from normal. Instead of heading straight to the meter, he started walking through the flat, inspecting everything like he owned the place. He went into the bathroom and immediately pointed out cigarette ash on the windowsill. He didn't ask about it or explain why he was looking there, he just accused us of smoking indoors. It felt like he had known exactly where to look, as if he'd been watching us or snooping when we weren't home. The air was tense, and my boyfriend tried to stay calm, but it was clear the landlord was trying to intimidate us. That was when I'd had enough. I stepped out of the room with our rental contract in hand and told him he couldn't inspect the flat without giving proper notice. His response was chilling. He just smiled and said, "Well, your boyfriend let me in, so it doesn't matter." It wasn't about the ash or the flat, it was about control. He wanted us to feel like he could do whatever he wanted. And at that moment, I realized just how dangerous he could be. The situation escalated when the landlord confronted us about something deeply personal. One afternoon, completely out of the blue, he asked, "When were you going to tell me you're pregnant?" My heart stopped. My boyfriend and I hadn't told anyone yet, not even close friends or family. We had only found out recently and hadn't discussed it anywhere in the flat. I demanded to know how he knew. At first, he claimed he overheard us talking, but we knew that wasn't true. We hadn't spoken about it out loud at home. Then he said he saw it on Facebook, but our privacy settings were locked down tight, and neither of us had posted anything. The more he tried to explain, the more it didn't make sense. That's when the real fear set in. The only way he could have known was if he had been spying on us, either entering the flat when we weren't there or worse, watching us somehow. His knowledge felt like a violation, and the way he casually brought it up made it even worse. It wasn't just creepy, it was terrifying. After the pregnancy incident, everything felt more threatening. Little things around the flat started to stand out, drawers slightly open, items moved from where we had left them. It wasn't just paranoia, it was real. The landlord was coming into the flat when we weren't there. Every time we left, I wondered what he might be doing while we were gone. The worst part was not knowing how far he had gone. We started searching the flat for cameras, tearing through every corner, every fixture. There wasn't any obvious sign of surveillance, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched was constant. I couldn't relax, couldn't trust that our home was really private anymore. Even at night, I started keeping a key in the door to make sure he couldn't let himself in. It felt like a temporary solution to a much bigger problem. The fear never went away, and every sound outside made my heart race. Living there became unbearable, but we had no proof to take to the police. All we could do was endure it, knowing we were stuck until the lease ended. We knew we couldn't stay there much longer. The first step was to document everything: the unannounced visits, the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't, and the signs of him entering when we weren't home. We wrote formal complaints to both the landlord and the estate agent, outlining every incident in detail. It felt like shouting into the void, but we had to do something. The estate agent promised to look into it, but nothing changed. The landlord ignored our letter completely, acting as if nothing had happened. That silence made it worse. It was like he was daring us to do something, knowing we didn't have enough evidence to stop him. We started preparing to leave as soon as the lease ended. It wasn't easy, moving is expensive, and we didn't have many options. But staying wasn't safe. We made sure to secure everything until the day we could finally pack up and get out. Every step toward leaving felt like reclaiming a small piece of control. Even so, the fear stayed with us. When the lease finally ended, we left as fast as we could. Packing up and driving away felt like a weight was lifted, but it wasn't total relief. Even in our new place, the fear lingered. Every knock at the door or unexpected sound made me jump. It took months to stop looking over my shoulder, wondering if the landlord might find a way to interfere with our lives again. What stayed with me most was the helplessness. We had done everything right, followed the rules, paid rent on time, but none of it mattered. He had control because it was his property, and we had no way to stop him. What scared me even more was the thought of future tenants, people who might not see the warning signs until it was too late. Even now, I wonder how he knew so much about us. Was he entering the flat, or was it something worse? I'll probably never know, but one thing is certain: I'll never ignore a gut feeling again. That flat wasn't just a bad rental, it was a reminder of how quickly your sense of safety can be taken away. Some things you don't forget, no matter how far you go. Sometimes, a deal that seems too good to be true is exactly that, a trap in disguise. When I found an apartment in Chicago, it felt like a miracle. It was a 6-room place, spacious and affordable, on the top floor of a duplex. The rent was just $775 a month, which seemed impossible for the size and location. I thought I had lucked out. The landlords were an elderly couple who lived downstairs. When I moved in, they seemed harmless enough. They smiled and waved when we passed each other in the yard, and everything felt normal at first. The agent had mentioned they were very religious, but I didn't think that would matter. After all, I was a quiet tenant, and I kept to myself. But looking back, those first few weeks were just the calm before the storm. What I didn't realize was that these landlords weren't just strict, they were watching, waiting, and ready to make my life a living nightmare. It didn't take long for things to start feeling strange. At first, it was small, awkward moments. The landlords seemed uncomfortable whenever they saw my boyfriend coming over. They didn't say anything directly at first, but their looks made it clear they didn't approve. I brushed it off, thinking it wasn't a big deal. Then one day, the old woman knocked on my door. I thought she needed something, so I opened it. But instead of asking for help or making small talk, she looked me in the eye and said, "Have you ever gotten an abortion?" The question came out of nowhere, completely inappropriate and invasive. I was too shocked to respond, so I just slammed the door. That moment stayed with me. It wasn't just rude, it felt like a warning. These weren't just religious landlords with opinions. They felt entitled to judge me, to insert themselves into my personal life. And I had no idea how far they were willing to go. The true invasion of privacy became clear when I made a disturbing discovery. There was a door at the bottom of the staircase in my apartment. At first, I thought it led to a communal laundry room or storage space. But one day, out of curiosity, I opened it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The door didn't lead to any shared space, it opened directly into the landlord's living room. Their furniture was just a few feet away, and I could hear the faint sound of a TV playing. I quickly shut the door, feeling unsettled. I had no idea our spaces were so connected, and it made me realize how easily they could access my apartment. From that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That door wasn't just a physical connection, it was a way for them to intrude on my life whenever they wanted. And knowing they had full control over it filled me with dread. After discovering the door, the landlord's behavior started to feel even more intrusive. They began knocking on my door constantly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, for the smallest reasons. One time, it was to remind me to take out the trash. Another time, it was about the way I parked my car. It felt less like they were being helpful and more like they were finding excuses to control me. Things inside my apartment also started to change. I'd leave for work and come back to find little things out of place, a window shut that I'd left open, or my shower dripping when I knew I hadn't used it. At first, I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but it happened too often to ignore. Someone had been in my apartment, and I knew exactly who it was. The worst part was knowing they had access, and there was nothing I could do about it. No lock could keep them out. My apartment no longer felt like my own. It felt like they were watching, waiting, and slowly tightening their grip on my life. One morning, I got ready to leave for work, but when I opened the front door, I froze. The stairs leading down to the yard were gone, not broken, completely removed. All that was left was an empty gap where they used to be. My heart raced as I looked down and saw the stairs stacked neatly on the landlord's porch. Confused and panicked, I called their house phone over and over, but no one picked up. Eventually, their son came outside and told me they were remodeling the porch and hadn't thought to warn me. He casually said I'd have to use the door that led into their living room to get out. I had no choice. I walked through their kitchen, where the elderly couple sat silently at the table, staring at me as I passed. They didn't say a word. Their blank, unblinking expressions made my skin crawl. I rushed out as quickly as I could, but the feeling stayed with me. This wasn't about repairs. This was about power, and they wanted me to know I was completely at their mercy. The breaking point came one evening when the landlord sent their son to fix a supposed issue in my apartment. When he showed up, it was immediately clear something was wrong. He reeked of alcohol, and his movements were unsteady. I opened the door cautiously, trying to keep the interaction short, but before I could say anything, he became aggressive. He picked up a large wrench and swung it toward me without warning. I ducked instinctively, and he stumbled forward, nearly falling. My heart was pounding as I bolted down the newly repaired stairs and called the police. When they arrived, they listened to my story but shrugged it off, saying they couldn't do much since there was no physical contact. I later found out their daughter worked on the police force, which explained the lack of action. That realization hit me hard. Not only was I unsafe in my own home, but the system that was supposed to protect me seemed unwilling to help. I knew then that I had to leave, no matter what it took. After the violent incident, I knew I couldn't stay another night in that apartment. My boyfriend and I didn't even bother packing everything properly. We grabbed the essentials: clothes, important documents, and anything we couldn't replace, and stuffed them into bags and boxes. Every minute we spent there felt dangerous, like they might come back at any moment. By midnight, we loaded everything into his van, and we were gone. We didn't have anywhere to go, so we spent the next few weeks bouncing between cheap motels and even sleeping in the van when we had no other choice. It was exhausting and terrifying, but it was better than staying in that house. Every time I thought about the landlords, I felt a mix of fear and anger. They had taken more than my safety. They had taken my sense of control. But getting out was the only thing that mattered. Even with all the uncertainty, at least we were free from them. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe again. Even after we left, the fear didn't go away. Every knock at a door or shadow in a window brought back the memories. The landlords had managed to make me feel powerless in my own home, and that feeling stayed with me long after we were gone. No matter how far we moved, it felt like they still had control over a part of me. What scared me most was how easy it had been for them. They had access to my space. They manipulated the situation, and they used their connection to the local police to stay untouchable. It made me realize how vulnerable tenants can be when landlords abuse their power. The thought of new tenants moving into that apartment, walking into the same trap, kept me up at night. Looking back, I wish I had trusted my instincts from the start. The little things I ignored, the strange looks, the intrusive questions were all warning signs. But at least I learned one thing. No amount of convenience or low rent is worth sacrificing your safety. That lesson will stay with me forever.